Hi, Chris Opfer with Bloomberg Law here at the Littler Executive Employer Conference. Joined at the table by two Littler attorneys, Cindy Ann Thomas, who's a principal, and Amber Spataro, who's a shareholder with the firm. We're here to talk about politics in the workplace, protests, civility, things like that, getting a lot of attention in the national media these days, partly being tied back to the last presidential election. In your experience, I'm curious what you've seen. It's been about a year and a half since President Trump was elected. Just stemming from that time on, have you seen an uptick, whether it's related to the election or not? Have you seen any changes in what the issues that employers are dealing with when it comes to that area?
Absolutely, absolutely. What we have seen in the past year and a half, Chris, is willingness and an empowerment, if you will, for people to be more vocal about how they are feeling about some traditionally pretty incendiary areas, some tricky areas, some controversial areas. And that is in large part because they have witnessed the highest levels of leadership feeling very comfortable about saying things in a way that we haven't traditionally seen in past administrations.
Sure.
So those individuals are speaking up at work.
And we can't ignore the aspect of social media, as that has now blurred the personal with the professional. So a lot of people are bringing their personal feelings, their political views, their opinions into the workplace.
And so what is the issue or issues that raises for employers who are wondering how to respond to these things?
On the legal side, there are several issues to be aware of, some of which is the National Labor Relations Act, which protects an employee's right to engage in protected concerted activity for mutual aid and protection. So we see that. There are various states that have laws against taking action against an employee for their off-duty conduct. So that would, of course, impact any kind of political activity, whether it be political advocacy on social media, protests, and potentially speaking in the workplace. There's other states that give employees First Amendment rights, something that normally they wouldn't have. So all those, from a legal perspective, all those different laws have to be considered and taken into account when you're deciding what do I do with employees who speak up in the workplace.
And what's tricky about this, Chris, is that these issues that are bubbling up in the workplace often are very multi-dimensional, if you will. So they don't necessarily violate a law, they don't necessarily breach a workplace policy, but they may have implications for a company's brand, for a company's reputation. They may have implications with respect to a company's commitment regarding diversity and inclusion. So just because, for instance, it may not be unlawful activity, it may not fit in with a company's culture. And as a result of that, companies are grappling really with the more nuanced areas of some of the conduct that is now coming into the workplace.
So you mentioned social media. I think a good example of how that comes into play is the case of the person who flipped off a motorcade that I think Donald Trump was in at the time, put it on social media, and I believe wound up getting fired for that. Just as an example of off-duty conduct, I mean, how does an employer, what are all of the things that an employer has to think about before they make a decision about what to do in a case like that?
Well, for that particular case, Chris, the most important thing that employer needed to think about was consistency. And in the complaint that woman later filed against her former employer, one of the issues was that another employee had been treated differently for doing what was essentially the same behavior. So that's where I think some of these issues also touch upon what we teach in basic discrimination law. As we say, consistency is key. So whatever you decide as an employer that you're going to do to either protect your brand or to either encourage or to downplay political advocacy or protests in the workplace, you have to make sure that you're treating employees fairly and you're treating them consistently.
And of course, you mentioned branding. There's a corporate strategy, branding, kind of a non-legal piece to this. How do they navigate that?
The interesting part is that, again, when you look at your brand, sometimes, for example, would it be okay if your employee went to an anti-gun rally when you as an employer are a gun manufacturer? How would you react to that? And that's some of the things that we discovered in our panel that the organizations are thinking about. They're walking through these scenarios of what if, what would we do, so that they have a plan in place. And also they have the appropriate policies in place, because it may be an eye-opener for them that, hey, maybe we don't have the policies to address this. Maybe we should talk about this. Or in the case of training, maybe we're not addressing this in training. We're not addressing how to have these tricky conversations with your coworkers and still be respectful.
Chris, what is really very critical with respect to protecting your brand is you don't want to wing it. You want to proactively put together your plan so that when these instances do happen, it isn't playing out for the world to see. The same ways in which the conduct that we are talking about is being live streamed, if you will. A company's response to these tricky situations are also happening live. So as a result of social media, it is so important to have a plan in place when your brand is compromised.
And you really only get one shot, right? There's no unpeeling what you've done.
Absolutely.
And that's where I, as a trainer and advice and counselor, I think the importance of preparing for this and having the policies in place and training for them is so important. To give people the tools, not just here's a piece of paper, this is what our policy is, but to give them the tools to be able to navigate this and to know how they're going to react in a certain situation when these issues do come up and they are provocative and they may evoke strong responses from your colleagues, your coworkers. How are you going to react? How is the organization going to react?
Employees have to know how to respond when they are put in a situation where they are poked in the eye, if you will, with respect to an issue, whether it has to do with something politically or socially, whether it has to do with, whether it's alt-right or Black Lives Matter or a day without immigrants, whatever the topic is when it comes to work. How are you going to answer? How are you going to know when to walk away? How to really check your emotions? We have to give, and organizations have to give employees tools and really skills with respect to either provoking these conversations, knowing time and place, and knowing when to walk away from these conversations. So those are typically not in a handbook.
Right.
And in this day and age, it is so important to bake them into your training programs.
And if they are baked in, this can avoid the subsequent legal issues and legal claims where you feel it's gotten to a point now where both of these employees are out of control. We have to take some disciplinary measures. What do we do? How do we do it? Is someone more culpable than someone else? And you don't have to go there if you've given them those tools in the first instance on how to behave and how to handle these kind of situations.
Well, these are certainly questions that aren't going away anytime soon, so we'll have to check back with you guys soon. That's all the time we have for now, but thanks for joining us.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.